You know, I've been around this world long enough to hear a lot of people talk about religion, about politics, about how things shape our society. And let me tell you, when Bernie Sanders came out and made that statement about Islam, I was literally left speechless because it's not every day you hear a major political figure speak with that kind of honesty and clarity. And what struck me first was how he framed the entire conversation, not in the usual political rhetoric that we're so used to where everything is about scoring points, but rather in a way that demanded attention, demanded respect for the beliefs of millions of people around the world, and forced us to confront uncomfortable truths that we often sweep under the rug. I mean, think about it. How often do you see a politician who has built his career on progressivism and social justice actually take a moment to address something as globally significant as Islam with both empathy and critical thinking without resorting to fear-mongering or shallow platitudes? And that's what's so remarkable about Bernie. He doesn't just make a statement to get applause. He challenges us to rethink our assumptions, to really look at the history, the culture, the contributions, the struggles, and the resilience of a religion that has often been misrepresented and misunderstood in Western discourse. And as I listened, I started to realize that this wasn't just about Islam in the abstract. It was about how we, as Americans, perceive the world, how our media frames stories, how our politicians sometimes fail to recognize nuance. And it hit me that Bernie was really calling out a deeper problem, a systemic issue, the kind of issue that goes beyond partisan politics. And that's why I found myself silent, because how do you respond when someone so carefully and thoughtfully exposes not just ignorance, but complicity in misunderstanding, when they force you to question your own biases, your own assumptions, your own casual acceptance of what you think you know? And it made me reflect on my own experiences, on the comedy I've done, the sketches I've written, the way I've approached social commentary. Because if someone like Bernie can stand up and articulate something so profound about Islam, about faith, about humanity, about the interconnectedness of our global society, then we all have a responsibility to listen, to think critically, and to speak honestly. And that's what I want people to take away. That this isn't a soundbite, this isn't a headline, this is a wake-up call, this is a challenge to engage with complexity, to reject oversimplification, to appreciate that Islam, like any major world religion, is diverse, rich, full of history, full of ideas that have shaped civilization in ways that many of us don't even realize. And Bernie Sanders, in his characteristic way, managed to cut through the noise, to shine a light on the truth and leave the rest of us not just thinking, but feeling the weight of responsibility. The responsibility to educate ourselves, to question the narratives we consume, to have honest conversations even when they're uncomfortable. And let me tell you, that's why I was speechless. Because in a world full of shallow commentary and empty promises, hearing a leader speak with that kind of moral clarity, intellectual rigor, and genuine concern for people, regardless of their religion or background, it's rare, it's inspiring, and it demands that we rise to the occasion and match that honesty in our own lives, in our own words, in our own actions. And that, my friends, is something I think we desperately need right now more than ever. And as I kept thinking about it, I realized that the implications of Bernie's words go far beyond politics or simple ideology, because when someone in his position speaks about Islam with that level of honesty, it forces a reckoning not just for politicians, but for every single one of us who consumes news, social media, and casual opinions without ever digging deeper. And I started reflecting on how often we as a society allow ourselves to be guided by fear or misunderstanding, how many times people hear a phrase, a headline, or a viral clip and immediately form judgments without bothering to explore context or history. And Islam, being one of the world's major religions, has been at the center of so many misrepresentations, whether through ignorance, sensationalism, or even deliberate manipulation. And Bernie Sanders, in his characteristic, straightforward yet empathetic way, dared to challenge all of that. Not by attacking anyone, not by condemning, but by demanding that we see the humanity, the complexity, and the truth behind a religion that has been present, influential, and inspiring for centuries, and educating, challenging assumptions, inspiring thought, and doing it with sincerity and courage. And it hit me that this is the kind of discourse that's missing everywhere, from our schools to our media, from our politicians to our everyday conversations. And I began asking myself, how often do we really take the time to understand the beliefs and experiences of others, to empathize, to question our own biases, to admit when we don't know enough? And how often do we, out of convenience, choose the easier path of judgment, stereotype, or dismissal? And Bernie Sanders forced us to confront all of that, because his words weren't just about Islam. They were about justice. They were about honesty. They were about accountability. They were about recognizing the dignity and worth of millions of people whose lives are shaped by faith and culture. And it was shocking, yes, in the sense that it caught me off guard, but it was also profoundly necessary, because in a world where the loudest voices are often the most misinformed, someone standing up and speaking truth with clarity and compassion is like a lighthouse cutting through a storm of confusion. And as I reflected more, I realized this. It wasn't just a political statement. It was a cultural wake to upcall, a challenge to rethink how we discuss religion, how we teach our children about difference, how we engage with ideas that are unfamiliar or uncomfortable, because the alternative is ignorance, the alternative is fear, the alternative is repeating the mistakes of history where misunderstanding leads to conflict. And I started thinking about the broader picture, about the responsibility that comes with being a public figure, whether it's a comedian, a politician, or anyone who has a platform, because words matter, framing matters, context matters. And here was Bernie Sanders using his voice in a way that was precise, deliberate, and deeply human. And it made me want to step back and reevaluate not just what I say, but how I say it, how I influence, how I provoke thought without exploiting emotion, how I make people confront ideas without pushing them away. And it dawned on me that this is exactly what good leadership looks like. Whether you agree with every detail or not, the courage to speak truth, to invite reflection, to challenge assumptions, and to do it in a way that fosters understanding instead of division. And that's why I was so struck, why I stayed silent for a moment, because it was overwhelming in the best possible sense, because it was rare, because it was honest, because it reminded me that even in the noise, even in the chaos, even in the polarized and distracted society we live in, voices like Bernie Sanders's exist to cut through that noise, to illuminate reality, to push us toward a deeper understanding of one another. And it made me realize that we all have a role to play, that every conversation, every discussion, every interaction is an opportunity to reflect, to educate, to challenge, and to grow. And in that moment, hearing Bernie Sanders speak, I felt a renewed sense of urgency, a renewed sense of responsibility, and a renewed sense of hope. Because if we can listen, really listen, and confront these truths without fear or ego, then maybe, just maybe, we can start building a society that is smarter, fairer, more compassionate, and more aware of the rich, diverse tapestry of human experience that surrounds us, and that, my friends, is why I can't stop thinking about what he said, why I can't stop reflecting on the courage it takes to speak like that, and why I am compelled to continue the conversation, to keep questioning, to keep analyzing, to keep pushing myself and others toward a deeper understanding of the world we live in. And that ultimately is the power of words when used with integrity, insight, and courage. And as I continued to think about Bernie's words, I realized that this isn't just a moment that exists in isolation. This isn't just a quote that gets thrown around on social media for clicks. This is part of a much larger conversation that we've been avoiding for far too long. And it made me start connecting the dots between history, politics, culture, and personal responsibility, because Islam, like every major religion, has a profound history that has shaped civilizations, shaped philosophy, science, art, literature, and yet so many of us in the West barely scratch the surface before forming our opinions. And that's where the problem lies. That's where misunderstanding breeds prejudice, and that's where fear starts to masquerade as knowledge. And Bernie Sanders, in his quiet, steady, almost understated way, challenged that entire mindset, forcing us to acknowledge complexity, nuance, and depth, forcing us to admit that maybe, just maybe, we've been too comfortable in our assumptions, too lazy in our willingness to learn, too willing to accept the simplistic narratives fed to us by headlines, by tweets, by sound bites, by people who would rather entertain than educate. And I thought to myself, as a comedian, as someone who spent years observing the absurdities of human behavior, how often do I miss the mark because I assume everyone knows what I know? How often do we all miss the mark because we take for granted context, history, perspective? And Bernie Sanders just held up a mirror and said, look, you need to do better, think deeper, question harder. And that hit me hard because it wasn't delivered as an attack. It wasn't delivered as a spectacle. It was delivered with intelligence, with care, with moral clarity. And that's a rare thing, a really rare thing. And as I thought more about it, I began reflecting on the media landscape, the way stories about Islam are framed, the way conversations about faith are simplified into sound bites, the way fear, sensationalism often drown out truth. And I realized that Bernie's words were a direct counter to that, a reminder that truth requires attention, requires reflection, requires courage, requires patience, requires listening when it's easier to talk, requires humility when it's easier to assume, requires empathy when it's easier to judge. And in that moment, I felt not just admiration, but a deep sense of responsibility, because hearing a leader speak like that in a world so full of noise and distraction is a wake-up call to all of us to elevate our own conversations, to elevate our own thinking, to reject laziness of mind and heart, to demand substance over spectacle. And then I started thinking about the personal implications, how every one of us in our daily interactions, in our families, in our workplaces, in our communities, have the power to either perpetuate misunderstanding or to challenge it, to either contribute to fear or to contribute to knowledge, to either stay silent or to speak thoughtfully, courageously, and responsibly. And that's exactly what Bernie was doing, speaking responsibly, speaking thoughtfully, speaking courageously. And that's why it left me not just speechless, but inspired. Because if someone in his position can take that risk, can step into the spotlight and challenge assumptions with honesty and clarity, then we all have the capacity to do the same in our own spheres, in our own lives, in our own conversations, in our own moments of choice. And I realized that this is what makes leadership meaningful, not the applause, not the headlines, not the ratings, but the ability to provoke thought, to challenge assumptions, to awaken reflection, to inspire action. And as I sat there thinking about the courage it takes to do that in a climate where nuance is often punished and controversy is rewarded, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a renewed sense of responsibility, a renewed sense of hope. Because if words can be used with such clarity, integrity, and insight, then maybe we all have a chance to raise the level of discourse, to push ourselves and others toward deeper understanding, to reject oversimplification, to embrace complexity, and to confront uncomfortable truths with courage and compassion. And that, my friends, is the true power of what Bernie Sanders did, what he said about Islam, and the impact it can have on all of us if we're willing to listen, to think, to question, and ultimately to act. And it reminded me that in a world so often driven by noise, by spectacle, by fear, by division, there are still moments, rare and precious moments, when words can cut through all of that, when truth can shine, when leadership can inspire, when a single statement can remind us of our responsibility to be better, to understand more, to engage thoughtfully, to confront ignorance, to embrace complexity, and to recognize the humanity and dignity of people whose experiences and beliefs may be different from our own. And that ultimately is why I was compelled to not just hear those words, but to carry them forward, to reflect on them, to share them, to challenge myself and others to live up to the example set by speaking truth with courage, empathy, and clarity, because that is what changes minds. That is what inspires hearts. That is what moves societies forward. And that, in the end, is the legacy of a statement that is far more than a statement, far more than politics, far more than headlines. It is a call to conscience, to thoughtfulness, to courage, to reflection, and to humanity itself.